Today on Dolby Creator Talks, we are continuing our coverage of the 2024 Academy Awards, this time with legendary cinematographer Edward Lachman, who has received his third Oscar nomination for the satirical horror film El Conde, directed by Pablo Larraín. I am so thrilled to have Ed Lachman on the podcast today because I have been a huge fan of his work for many years. He has worked with so many great directors, including Werner Herzog, Jean-Luc Godard, Wim Wenders, Steven Soderbergh, and Paul Schrader. He is maybe best known for his long collaboration with director Todd Haynes, for whom he has made 6 feature films, 2 of which earned him his previous Academy Award nominations for Carol and Far From Heaven. If you haven't seen El Conde yet, it is a big departure from Ed's previous work. It's a horror comedy satire reimagining the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet as a 250-year-old vampire who has lost his zeal for life. If that sounds like a wild premise, it is. It is also a very funny film, which is gorgeously shot, evoking classic horror films like Nosferatu and even the work of the great Orson Welles. I had so much fun with this conversation, which touches on both the art and the science of cinematography. But I started by asking Ed how he ended up collaborating with director Pablo Larraín after following his career for so many years.
Well, he was a director. I saw some of his early films. I think we met, we're trying to remember, it was either at the New York Film Festival or Telluride, but I was so taken that he was this South American director that always dealing with the social and political context of his stories about Chile, and it was primarily about the 70s. And he did a film Tony Manero and Postmortem and No, and but he always found a different visual language to tell the story. So he was highly aware of how to tell the story that would encompass what the content of the story was. And that's always what I gravitate to with a director, is that they're trying to find the language, and I work with them to find the language of what makes that story unique in itself. And we became friendly, and he said to me one day, and we only meet each other at like a festival, if I had a film or he had a film and we were at the same festival. He said, one day I'd love to bring you to Chile. But that was like 20 years ago, and then I was pleasantly surprised that we did a commercial in LA. And then about a month later, he said, would you come to Chile to shoot this film, this kind of gothic, noir, expressionistic, vampire film? And I go, wow, well, yeah. And it's about Pinochet. So how could I not say yes or no? Of course I would say yes. So I went to Chile, and the remarkable thing, it was all in Spanish. I barely speak a few words of Spanish. I had a crew I never worked with. Limitations in what equipment I had there, but somehow it all kind of fell into place. Once it was established that we were going to shoot truly in a monochromatic world, that he got permission from Netflix out of Mexico to shoot monochromatic and not shoot color and then transpose it into black and white. That set the wheels, like, what's the best? We couldn't shoot film. We wanted to shoot on black and white negative, obviously, which I've had some experience with. I'm Not There and other projects. But we were very limited, like where we could find a lab for black and white and the expense. So I reached out to a optical and mechanical engineer and cinematographer, a friend of mine, Marco Messenger in Stuttgart, and I said, Pablo has a connection or has always worked with Arri. I could look into the red monochromatic camera and do tests, but we had to have a lightweight camera for this. He also wanted to always shoot on this 15-foot techno crane, and we built the set around it too. He wanted the fluidity of the shot and to find the shot, and Arri had this XT and the 65 millimeter, but the XT was not 4K; it was 2K. The requirements in Netflix was 4K, obviously, and so we were going to shoot with the LF. So the question was, could they build an LF with a monochromatic sensor? And Marco and this contact we had through Stefan Schenk, and also the man who actually made it happen in Arri was Manfred Jahr. And I thought it wouldn't happen because they were building the Alexa 35 and it hadn't come out yet. So I thought, no way are they going to have, time to build or put together a black and white sensor in the LF. But lo and behold, like we talked to them 2 months before, 2 weeks before I was to shoot, they said they had a camera but I would have to test. And I was pleasantly surprised. It came to Chile, and I immediately started doing tests. And the native ASA, because of losing the Bayer pattern for color, I could then shoot about 3/4 of a stop over what they rated it. So if it was 800, that became 1280. 1280 became 2000. And I easily could shoot 3200 if I wanted. And it had incredible exposure latitude, which also was a great plus. And because a part of the story takes place during the French Revolution, I had to light things from fire and fire gags and at night. And so I really welcomed the extra ASA, the extra speed out of the sensor. But the incredible thing, so that was the first thing, that I had a black and white sensor, a true black and white sensor for the LF. Then two, I had been working with Zero Optics and Alex Nelson in LA, who rehouses glass. And he had told me about this glass, the original Baltars, not the super Baltars that were built in the late 50s for reflex cameras, but this was glass that was used for it's called the non-reflex or rack over cameras, where the whole movement of the camera would go out, you would have the viewing system, then you'd rack it back and you'd look at it like a rangefinder, So this glass was originally for the non-reflex camera, and it had a shorter focal length distance from the camera mount to the film plane, so it couldn't be used in reflex cameras. Glass kind of went out of favor because people have been shooting with reflex cameras ever since. And now, because of the digital cameras, you have a shorter focal plane distance that now you could use that glass. So now the problem was I had rehoused a set of the original Baltars.
And those lenses, what year would we be talking about? Those lenses were originally constructed?
1938.
Wow.
So all the black and white films in like Magnificent Ambers were shot with this glass. Parts like one or two lenses, Touch of Evil, one or two of the lenses for Citizen Kane, and even the 40 millimeter, because they didn't have that in the Super Baltar set. Gordon Willis used in The Godfather, the original Godfather. So, and what was the difference with the glass? Well, that glass was made with lead, which we can't do today. And I think it has refractory quality to it. And the coatings were totally different. They were very simple one layer coating, and they were hand polished. So they have fall off, a little like what the Cook lenses, the Speed Pancros also have, which I bet, but they only cover Super 35. But the fall off has a wonderful quality to it. It's like now everybody wants to go back to old glass to like do anything to degrade the images that camera manufacturers are making these chips, 4K, 6K, 8K, and then we all want to go the other way to create images that have a texture and a feeling and not make it so analytical. So he worked with me, Alex Nelson, and we found glass to complement the Baltar glass from the 40 millimeter down. And so it became a 21, 25, a 35, 40, 50, 75, 100, 135, and 152. So he reworked the glass, and we found the way that would complement what was already existing with the Baltar glass that we had. So now I had glass that was made for black and white photography, or the glass that was available for black and white photography. Then the third thing was I could now use filters. I could now use black and white filters that I used on I'm Not There and parts of Wonderstruck and you think you can do the same in post. And I worked with Harbor and Joe Goller in New York. And when I was losing light, I had to pull the filters because you lose stop with filters. And we tried to recreate, and we could almost get there, but you couldn't go as far as you could go with the filter because the filter marries, if I try to think about it, the flesh tone to the background. And when you just layer it, try to do it later, it's not the same against what you have in the foreground to the background.
So this was exactly one of the questions I had for you, Ed, because one of the things that so stood out for me about the look of the film is I felt like the characters were kind of bleeding into the environments, and there were the skin tones were so fascinating to me that they didn't pop off of the backgrounds like I'm used to seeing people look, especially like in a high contrast black and white look. It was so like silvery and gorgeous and so much texture to it.
That has a lot to do with the fourth. But did I get 1, 2, 3? Yeah. All right. So the fourth is the EL zone system. And this is something I've been working on for the last 10 years. And it was primarily something I was doing for myself because when the digital world came, I'm an old guy and my background is film, and I've learned everything about exposure and everything is how to control the negative. And I go back to like when I was a student, I was go like, how do I recreate that photograph or that painting in a motion picture? Well, of course, I was learning about Ansel Adams' zone system in where you can place the exposure from 18% and understand where you can hold the highlights or lose the highlights, or where you can hold the shadow detail. I'm someone that likes to hold the shadow detail and the highlights, and you find that mid-range of what stop you place. It's what cinematographers do all the time, is figure an average out to hold what information you want. Well, I tried to work with this idea, like, couldn't that be done in the digital world? Because we have IRE, which if anybody I ask knows what IRE, they don't. Do you know what IRE is?
I do not.
IRE stands for the International Radio Engineers from 1895, when they didn't even have sound, and they used it as a way of recording information about lightning from the International Radio Engineers. So obviously, these brilliant technicians that made the digital cameras never thought about the analog world. They percentages, but the big problem is they thought in linear and not logarithmic. And what that means is if you go 2 to 2.8 in a film exposure, you need double the amount of light to make that 2.8. You need double that amount of light to go from 2.8 to 4. That's how our meters are set up. That's how our lenses are set up. And that's how we talk to a gaffer on the set. Well, guess what? Every time I would go to a DIT and I would say, it's f4, right? He goes, no, it's 5.6 or 6.3. Why is there a discrepancy between what my analog meter reads and what the digital information, waveform monitors, IRE, false, which I call false exposure? And it's because of this idea that they go linear. So a simple way to remember it is 2 to 2.8 is 0 to 10. Then 2.8 to 4 is 0 to 10. They don't double the amount of light to understand what we traditionally understand as exposure. So you could say, I've talked to a number, cameramen that are like, on the A list, and I would say, well, they say, I don't use a light meter. I go off of the monitor. I go, well, that's great. But what happens if you could hit a button, record exactly how you've exposed the scene with a color pattern that represents 18% gray, which, hey, 18% gray is gray, not green, and then warm colors for overexposure and darker colors for underexposure. And on either side of the 18% gray is half a stop. Because for me, the most important part, and it was for Ansel Adams when he and Archer when they talk about it, is how you place the exposure on a face, because that's how I balance the rest of my exposure in a scene. The face is the most important, and then I can balance the background, your white wall behind you, your books behind you. I can understand what the exposure latitude of that is. Well, what happens if you could hit a button, record what you've lit, and come back a year from now and recreate it exactly the what you have? So they go, I could do that. But for other people, it's a great tool using your sensor as your light meter. And not all monitors are the same. You can have the same manufacturer with monitors, 2 or 3 different monitors, and they all read differently. This way, 18% gray is 18% gray, even if the monitor is off. You have the same interpretation of your exposure. So there are many factors. Plus, in a documentary, it's very fast to see where your exposure is. So basically, it's set up for exposure. So to get back to El Conde. So what I was able to do was I felt like I was Ansel Adams on the set, because I could now place the exposure where I had information in detail in the highlights to the shadow detail. And that's why the film has this incredible mid-range, because that's what we're talking about, is what everybody wants to know. How did I get the grays? I got the grays because of the EL zone system, Aries sensor, and the filters.
All three elements came together. Interesting.
I just thought of this is there used to be a filter called the low light filter, an LLD, that they theoretically said you could shoot late day and it was easier to time it back. It was like a haze filter. but you didn't lose any stop. So I was using that in a lot of the interiors, and that may be added to the look.
And so, how much of is this all part of your kit now? I know you just shot another film for with Pablo about Maria Callas, right? Is this all still stuff that you're continuing forward?
I asked, hey, is there any way I could adapt the EL zone system to film? But no, you can't. No, you don't need to. But it was like I was now so dependent on it um, that it's funny. I thought about how do I use the EL zone system on film, but there's too many variables that would change.
That's amazing. I have so many questions for you about El Conde, but I've seen pictures of you on the set, and you and Pablo had a very interesting way of shooting some of those dialogue sequences. You know, you did no over the camera, no over the shoulders for you guys. I've seen so the pictures I've seen. You had two cameras facing opposite directions in between the actors. Can you tell how did you guys arrive at that setup, and what did that gain for you?
Well, that was something I learned from Pablo. That was Pablo's approach, and I think he used it before me. But yes, with digital cameras, you can. We tried to do it actually in this new film Maria, but the film cameras have too much width to them. So but with the digital cameras, we could put cameras opposite each other. And obviously, for a director, they love that because then they have that performance from both sides in one take, which, other people, two cameras over the shoulder, but you try to keep the other camera out of the shot. But this way you could do it. You didn't have to worry about seeing each other, because it was right in the center of them. Then the question was for me, how do I light two people with these opposite facing cameras? But I went back to like using a China ball, and one China ball right or left of them, one China ball, but some people I used right, sometimes left. And that was enough illumination and it was wonderful for the eyes. And that's how we did it. But that was something that, again, I learned from his expertise and thinking, always visually about how to tell the story.
That's fascinating. So, what was the reaction to the actors having these cameras? Like, they weren't between each other. Did that affect? How did they get used to that in the performance?
I didn't see any problem for them. All those films. I did want to say this, on a philosophical. All those films are about uh, how justice is a collective desire, and but that isn't always the case, and how horrible crimes in history don't get due justice, and that's really what Pablo's work has been about in Chile, about the inequality of what the '70s brought to the populace, to the people of Chile, and so it's not this traditional romantic perception of a vampire film, but it looks at how metaphorically and literally uh, blood is taken from the politics, the culture, and the society, and how a society can be seduced by fascism. So it's just this allegorical, satirical comedy in a way, but it's maybe a way to look from a distance. You ask about the use of black and white, but if you think it's another way of unless you're colorblind, you don't see black and white. It's another way of abstracting the world and giving it distance, and so you can look at these people maybe a little more farcical. And the Chilean people have never been able to rectify the pain and the suffering many people went through and their families losing, their loved ones. And so maybe this is a way to help people look at it from a distance and maybe understand their own complicity in something like this.
I thought Pablo's approach to the story was so ingenious. It was so disarming. I got to see the film at Telluride
Oh,
with an audience, and it was it's it was surprising to me how funny the film played. It is a comedy. And so I'm just curious for you in approaching that subject matter, this idea of reimagining Pinochet as a 250-year-old vampire. What did that immediately open up for you in terms of thinking about how you were going to design the look of the film?
well, that was all happening with the production designer and Pablo, because they knew the intricacies. Like here, that he's living in refuge, in this farmhouse with all these millions of dollars, but with bad taste. They're dining room tables with plastic chairs. Well, you didn't see it in color, but they were orange. Um, so he's making a comment about how tasteless, they were, even with all their money, and how he wouldn't bite the children, but of course the children are like vampires trying to find where he's hid the money, and he's going senile. And,
Yeah, who are the real vampires here?
yeah, exactly. They're all the same. I just, wanted to say, the Chileans never found justice or relief. And so, in a way, he lives on in their memory like a vampire because he's always there. He was never tried for his crimes and he died a multimillionaire.
If you'll indulge me, there are a few scenes that just really jumped out at me that I wanted to ask you about your approach to capturing, because they were so remarkable to me. I'm thinking about the remarkable sequence with the kids going over in the boats early in the morning. It's just so exquisite. Tell me about capturing that sequence.
He knew these locations. In fact, he had shot uh, an earlier film, Emma, in that area. But we used a lot of smoke in the film. But shooting early in the morning there, you would have the fog coming in over the water, and so that gave it an element. And also, like the wonderful thing in Chile is if they don't have something, they make it themselves. And I probably had the best fog machines I've ever seen. Maybe because they don't have the restrictions that we have here, but they built their own fog machines. They built filter holders for me. I was just astounded about how resourceful they were on their own to find solutions to problems. So I think it had a large part to do with it. The time of the day we shot and supplementing it with our own fog.
I love the way, that whole basement sequence. I love, when the general goes to the glass case and his uniform is in it. He, puts the uniform on and then goes for the night flight. Tell me about shooting that sequence.
Well, I think that's a reference, kind of making fun of the Batman sequence. Like he's
The superhero costume in the glass case. Yeah.
exactly. Like, it's a superhero evil case. So again, like this tunnel and where they are underground, and had these air vents built overhead, and so I would have light and I used the cheapest kind of lights I could get. There was par cans, theatrical par cans through tracing paper, and then I used practicals on the walls. Well, that's how I lit that one room, was just to create that ambiance around the wardrobe, and that the light that spills off of that case is what's illuminating them.
Amazing. And then I love the sequence when when the young nun takes flight for the first time and is exploring that was just such a remarkable sequence for me.
That was something he saw. It was in a commercial, I believe, and it was a group, aerial and circus performers that had formed a company to do wiring wires and do flights for photographic. And Pablo adapted it for this film. And the remarkable thing was the character Carmencita. She was in life was actually studied ballet, so she really wanted to do Paula. Her name was Paula Luxinger. She really wanted to do. We had a stunt double, but the stunt double did maybe 20%, 15% of that. And she actually did most of it herself. And the way that worked was she was on the wire of a 90-foot crane. And we had a grip holding a Ronin base that was a remote control with the camera on it. And then the operator was below, Pablo was below operating off of the grip holding the remote head in position. And it builds a credibility and authenticity to where you are and what she's actually doing, I think. And the night stuff was done with blue screen, and so that had to be done with blue screen. And also we couldn't bring up, 80-year-old man on the crane. But he was pretty agile. He was more agile than I was. He got around. The feeling, look, you can do everything in post, but the wind, the light, everything, people get the effect like, wow, how did you do that? There's an effect that you can't, and there's things that happen like a mistake or the way someone moves that you can't always build into post or visual effects. If it didn't happen, how do you know how to do that? I mean, that's what's so wonderful about shooting in reality is the things that happen that you don't anticipate.
You mentioned something I wanted to ask you about, which is you said Pablo was operating, and I know that yes, your director was your camera operator as well. That must have been a very interesting experience for you. Tell me about how good as a camera operator is Pablo.
He's excellent. He's always been around the camera, not just he studied still photography at one time, and he's very good with wheels. And they always say the first audience is the operator, and that's why I like to operate. But there was so much I had to do with the language and whatever that it was very direct that he could talk. Actually, the key grip, Mumford, who's a wonderful key grip, didn't speak English. So he had the direct communication to the grip about moves and on the crane. So it made sense that he operate. And then that gave me the freedom to do what I could do with the electrical, because I had to be more hands on than a gaffer I've worked with for 35 years, John DeBlau in New York. At one point, I wanted to bring him, but he's getting as old as I am, so he was not into going to Chile.
Yeah. Tell me about the grading process, the DI, and your involvement in that part of the filmmaking
Yeah, I work primarily with Joe Goller at Harbor,
in New
and
York.
yeah, in New York, and they just had been working with Baselight, and he's a big advocate of Baselight right now. And in some ways, they always said black and white is so much more difficult than color. But in some ways, for me, I prefer black and white now, because even the times of the day that change, like color temperature that you have to deal with, you don't have to deal with that in black and white. Black and white is just the exposure value of, you can shoot late in the day or early in the day or midday. And if you keep the balance between the contrast, you can almost make it look like it's the same time. Not almost, you can, you know. When you shoot in film, you always have to deal with the
Color
change
temperature, yeah.
temperature. And so I really like black and white for that reason.
Yes. Well, it comes through so clearly in this film. It's a remarkably looking film, and congratulations on your Academy Award nomination for it. Well deserved.
Thank you. That was like a total surprise that this little film in Chile got this recognition from my, peers who so I appreciate that. And
That's great.
It's great for the film community in Chile.
Many thanks to Ed for joining us on the podcast today. Best of luck to him at the Academy Awards, being held once again at the Dolby Theater in Hollywood on March the 10th. You can check out Ed's Oscar-nominated work on El Conde right now in Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos on Netflix. And an extra special thanks to our friends at Netflix for helping us put this conversation together. Speaking of awards season, as I mentioned up top, this episode is part of our continuing coverage of the Academy Awards. If you'd like to hear more conversations with fellow Oscar nominees in this category and more, be sure you are subscribed to us, the Dolby Creator Talks podcast. Many of these awards are tough to pick, and we will continue to offer these in-depth conversations filled with unique insights into the world of each of these nominated artists, which may make it just a little bit easier for you to fill out your Oscar ballot, whether you are an Academy voter or you simply want to do better in your annual office pool at the Oscars. You can find links to our show on all the major podcasting platforms, including the video version on YouTube, in our show notes. Or you can simply search for Dolby wherever you get your podcasts. If you're curious to know more about the Dolby Institute, head on over to dolbyinstitute.com. There you'll find information about all of our programs. You can access the entire library of episodes of this podcast, and you can sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, this is Dolby Creator Talks. I'm your host, Glenn Kaiser. Our producer and editor is Michael Coleman. Our executive producers are Amanda Schneider and Jack Ferry, with additional editing by Matt Nixon. And our production coordinator is Karen Marroquin. Thank you for joining us.